Welcome friends to Valentine's season. That's right, it's the month of love, we're nearing Valentine's Day. And I'm not usually that into Valentine's Day or anything, but this year I want to feel the love. So right now we're going to pick out a couple of books for us to read together this week that are romance or romance adjacent, and we're just going to enjoy ourselves. There is just one little hitch in our plan, and that is that I have not had a great track record with genre romance. I've read a handful in my time. I would say the only romance books that I have loved would be the Brown Sisters trilogy by Talia Hibbert, but honestly, who didn't love those books? So I do want to try out a couple of books that are like true romance, but I also want this week to go well for me as a reader. So we're also going to pick some books that have strong romantic or even like just relationship themes that I think are going to be a little bit more up my alley. But let's start with the romance books. Firstly, I have on my shelf The 7 Year Slip by Ashley Poston. This was on so many favorites videos. Everybody was reading and loving this in 2023. And so even though I know I'm not much of a romance reader, I was sucked into the hype and I bought myself a copy. So this is the perfect week to try it out. There's a little bit of a speculative timey-wimey element to this book, which as a Doctor Who fan, I'm obviously looking forward to. So that is the first book on our list. Now the other romance book I was thinking we could try out this week, I don't actually have in physical copy, but I've had it on my Kindle for years. That is A Princess in Theory by Alyssa Cole. Now I have actually read from Alyssa Cole before, but I haven't read any of her romance. I just read her thriller book that time she came out with a thriller, and I did really like it. So I feel like I could have a good time with this. I think it's about a girl who finds out that she's basically like a long lost princess. I think in this book we're going to get truly peak wish fulfillment kind of stuff. And I think this week will be a perfect week to finally get to this ebook that I've had on my Kindle for years. I don't know if I need to add my Kindle to our stack. Okay, so those are our two true genre romance books that we're going to be reading this week. Now we need to sprinkle in a little bit of something that's a bit more me. Now when I think of romance or relationship focused books that I love, the first thing that came to mind was Open Water by Caleb Azumah Nelson. This was my favorite book of 2022. This is absolutely not a genre romance. It's a literary story that focuses on the relationship between these two characters. And it was just incredible. I loved it so much. So I think literary fiction with a focus on relationships and romance could be a win for me. And I do have a book that I think fits the bill. That is Love in the Big City by Sung Young Park, and this is translated by Anton Her. And apparently it tells the story of a gay man searching for happiness in the lonely city of Seoul. From what I've heard, we follow this young man through a few of his kind of like major relationships in his early adulthood. And that includes a variety of kinds of relationships, from platonic friendships to just sex to romantic ones. And apparently it's a moving exploration of millennial loneliness, so I'm sure I'll relate. Next up is a book I have been dying to get to, and that is The Vampires of El Norte. Now, I've heard a lot of people talk about being quite disappointed in this book because they thought they were getting into kind of like a horror vampire book. And I guess the disappointment stems from the fact that the vampires aren't really like the main part of the story. Instead, the focus is on a relationship. And it's set in the 1840s in Mexico. So this has been a book I've been itching to get to. I'm so excited. And I've heard people say that they just were kind of obsessed with the relationship and the romance in this book. So I'm so excited. I can't wait to be obsessed too. Okay, so we've already got 4 books and this is just a weekly reading vlog. But I have one more thing that I feel like we should be able to squeeze in. You know, I'm a big fan of a graphic novel, and I recently picked up Mooncakes. This is a young adult graphic novel featuring witches and other supernatural creatures. I think there's a bit of a mystery, but there is also a romance. It says on the blurb, against a backdrop of a slowly rekindling romance, Tam and Nova must investigate the dark supernatural forces eager to claim wolf magic for evil. So it sounds like we got a bit of a slow burn, second chance romance maybe. And if you tell me that both Tilly Walden and Kay O'Neill have blurbed a graphic novel, like, I mean, it's an instant 5-star prediction for me. I don't know why I still have my Kindle here, like representing A Princess in Theory, but this is our stack. That means we are going to be trying to read 5 books in 5 days. I was gonna say a week, but if I'm gonna have time to edit, I need to read these in 5 days. Here's me thinking I was making a cute, fun, playful little Valentine's vlog, and actually I'm making a reading challenge. I need to stop talking and get to reading. So I'm very happy to say that last night I did start and finish A Princess in Theory by Alyssa Cole, which is the first in the Reluctant Royals romance series. So I know Alyssa Cole is known for her romance, but I've actually read her thriller book. I got the audiobook through Libra FM's ALC influencer program, and I remember listening to that and just having such a good time. I think at the time I rated it around a 4-star. I really enjoyed it. And I do remember at the time thinking that I needed to try out something else from Alyssa Cole, some of her romance, but I just never got around to it. So I'm very glad to have finally tried out her romance, the thing that she's known for. So this really does feel like a fairy tale retelling in like a contemporary sort of setting in so many ways. Basically, we meet our main character, Naledi, who is a grad student. She's an epidemiologist. And for a while now, she's been getting these weird emails saying that she is the long lost princess of this small African country and that her African prince is waiting for her to return. Obviously, she assumes that these are just some weird kind of scam, so she doesn't pay any attention. But as we continue on through the story, we find out that those emails were actually legit. And so Thabiso, the prince, has come to New York to try and find her. But the minute he lays eyes on her, he realizes that he's actually quite attracted to her, and so he decides to pretend to just be like a regular person. All the while he's kind of falling in love with this woman who he has been told his entire life that as children, they were kind of like selected to be married and to be prince and princess and eventually king and queen. So obviously it's a little bit like over the top, it's a little bit theatrical, but I did find myself really liking Naledi and Thabiso and their romance. Now, I am not someone you would call a romance reader. I mean, I like romance in my books, but whenever I try to read romance, like the genre, I haven't had an awful lot of luck. And while I did have fun with this book while I was reading it, I think there were parts of it that obviously were intentional tropes. They're intentionally part of the genre and all of that sort of stuff that I didn't love. One of those would definitely be the whole deception element of him being a prince and not telling her. And that's intentional, right? Like that's the main conflict in the book. But I think for me, if I'm going to read a romance where I'm supposed to just like be giddy and giggly and kick at my feet, and you're going to include a deception element, I need it to be like a bit silly, or I need to know that like the other character isn't going to care too much. Whereas one of the main things we learn about Naledi is that she grew up an orphan. She was orphaned. Both of her parents died when she was very young. But basically because of her experience, both being an orphan, but then also like growing up in the foster care system, it's very clear to us throughout the entirety of the book that one of Naledi's kind of like major challenges in her life is the inability to trust people or feel secure and safe in relationships. And this is something we're reminded of constantly. So to have like the main conflict of the book be built around deception and to be building up to that for like quite a big chunk of the book that we as the reader knows, but we know that Naledi doesn't know. Honestly, I just found it really stressful. Like I said, I did enjoy this overall. I like the characters, and I mean, it was fun getting to know them and to learn more about where they're from and to see both of them connect in ways that they haven't been able to connect with other people, all that cute gooey stuff. I think I would be interested in trying another Alyssa Cole, but I don't know that I would be particularly interested in continuing in this series in particular, The Reluctant Royals. I totally get the fantasy around royalty and, let's be honest, wealth, but it's just not something that I'm particularly interested in. And I think from memory she's coming out with another thriller this year, so maybe that's something I should keep an eye out for too. With all that said, that is our first romance out of the way for this video. Now I think what I want to do next is to dive into something a little bit more traditionally my speed, a little bit more literary. That's not to say one is better than the other, but like as a reader, it tends to be what I'm more drawn to. So I think I'm gonna get stuck into Love in the Big City next. What do you reckon, Ollie? You wanna be on the internet? What you doing? Ready to talk about some books? So Ollie and I are here to talk to you about the two books that I have finished last night and this morning. Firstly is Love in the Big City by Sung Young Park. This, as I mentioned, is like a translated literary work. In this book we follow a millennial young adult gay man living in Seoul, and it's kind of structured into 4 different sections, and throughout the book we get to, I don't know, have like a bit of a glimpse into, I'd say, the 4 main relationships in his life. The first of these relationships is with his female best friend, who like they actually lived together for a little while, like during college and after college, I think. The second relationship is the very complex relationship that he has with his very Christian mother. And then there are also 2 very different romantic relationships with 2 very different men. I liked this book, but it never sucked me in to the point where I was like in love with it. For me, there was just something about the writing that was a little detached. And then I think too, the relationships and like the insight we got into them, I feel like especially when it comes to the romantic relationships, there was just something quite unpleasant and toxic about those relationships, and not in a way that was very like reflective and gave us an opportunity to see some or all of the characters grow in any kind of way. I think the book very successfully captures messy, complicated kind of relationships and dynamics. But at least for me, that's kind of all it did, was capture it and portray it very effectively. It didn't go that step further and have the sense of reflection or like intimacy with like the narrator that I often tend to really love in a book. One of the things that I hear people say about this book is that they just love the writing. And I both agree and disagree, at least from like a subjective personal experience kind of perspective. For the most part, this book reads very colloquial, very chatty, like the author is just kind of like talking at you. So most of it is pretty straightforward, but every now and then he comes out with a paragraph or so that is just sublime. I lay down with him in the dark room and held him close. I touched his hair, flattened from the cap he'd worn all day, felt his stiff neck and the tattooed skin that was cooler than the rest of his body. He put his arm around my shoulders. We lay still for a moment, holding onto each other without the least bit of distance between us. The shape of my chest, the length of my arms, my whole body seemed to exist in order to fit perfectly with his. And his warm head against my chest made me feel I was hugging something as vast and precious as a universe. Concentrating on the heat of his skin and the sound of his breathing, whispering in my ear, made me completely lose sense of who I was. I became something not me, not anything. Just another part of the world that was him. I think aside from those moments of especially beautiful language, my favorite things about the book had more to do with just the very like mundane representation of gay life in Seoul. I felt like this book invited us to take a glimpse into this very particular scene, this very particular time and place, which obviously I've not experienced. And there's actually a translator's note in the back of the book by Anton Her, who is a Korean gay man himself. And he said, "Until I read Sangyang Park, I had no idea how much I'd subconsciously craved for someone to put my experience of my world in my time to print, and to give my brief life here and now the sacred consecration of literature." So obviously that own voice's representation is so powerful and so important. And going alongside that, I think the other element of this book that I appreciated so much was the exploration and the representation of AIDS and HIV, and especially the stigma around it, both internal and external. I think in a lot of ways, so many of the characters are just kind of really not very nice, quite miserable people, which did make reading this book perhaps a little bit less enjoyable and a little bit tedious at times. Having said that, I finished it last night, and just kind of being able to sit with having read this book, like it being a past experience for me, I have a greater sense of appreciation for it. I'm really glad that I read this book, even if I didn't love reading it, if that makes sense. Which is something I don't know I can say about our next book, which is Mooncakes, the graphic novel I decided to throw in at the last minute, and that might have been a mistake. Now, we all know that I love graphic novels. I'm a graphic novel fiend. But if I had have known that this was like a werewolf romance, I wouldn't have picked it up. Now, to be entirely fair, we do know that I have an issue with like really learning about the books that I buy before I buy them. And this character here literally has ears and a tail. I don't know why I didn't notice that. Okay, so there was elements of this I liked. I liked that, you know, like one of our main characters is non-binary. I liked that the two grandmothers, they were gay. Lots of very casual queer rep throughout this book. I also liked like the grandmothers and the house and like the witchy kind of vibe that was going on. But to be perfectly honest, that is where my enjoyment ended. And I am not somebody to kink shame or to pass judgment on almost anything when it comes to like consenting adults, but equally there are some things that I am just really not into. Now, my own personal aversion to this may make it seem like this is more explicit than it is. It's not explicit at all. I am just not someone for whom animal or like we're transforming like humans into animals and then like human relations, like I'm not interested. It doesn't do it for me in any way. And so because that is like my own personal thing, again, no judgment, it was very hard for me to sink in and just enjoy this for what it was. And that is very clearly my fault. I have picked up a book that I should not have read. Like, it is not for me. So I think for our next read, I'm going to pick the safe option. I'm going to go for a human-human romance, and hopefully we get on a little bit better with this one. Wish me luck. Is it the same day as our last clip? Yes. Did I read this in one sitting? Also yes. The 7-year slip took me by surprise. Let's just say that. If I'm being honest with you, I was not enjoying myself for, I'd say, the first 50%. It's not that it was doing anything really all that wrong. I just wasn't in it. I wasn't having a good time. I think one of the things that I struggle with romance is obviously as a genre, it's very tropey. And now most genres are, right? But I suppose romance just kind of wears its tropes on its sleeve, which is one of the things that people love about it. It's one of the things that I, as an outsider, sometimes struggle with. And one of those tropes that I often find myself struggling with, say, like in this case, we have a female main character who, you know, has her hero, and she is like a neurotic, uptight person who is kind of like on the precipice of dealing with her trauma. She's got baggage that she hasn't dealt with before, which is why other relationships have never really worked for her in the past, but it's this relationship that is going to like heal and save her. And this book does lean a little bit on that trope, I'm not gonna lie, which is why I found myself kind of like resisting it, I suppose. And our main character is not only dealing with the grief of having lost her like a beloved aunt recently, she's also for most of her life struggled with intimacy and vulnerability. Basically, she's so afraid of being hurt that she seeks to control as much as she can in her life. And this is a story about her learning that you can't plan for everything. So yeah, for the first half of the book, it's not that I disliked her or that I was hating the book, it's just there's something about that trope and that focus for a romance book that just makes me feel a little uneasy. However, the second half of the book absolutely got me. Now, there is something in here that I'm sure many people consider a spoiler, which is why I hadn't heard it mentioned. To be fair, I did not go out of my way seeking content warnings, but I am going to mention it here. So if you don't want to be spoiled at all, I'm not going to tell you the details, but I'm going to tell you the thing. Basically, there is like suicide discussion in here. A character has killed themselves. And obviously, if you've been around here long enough, you will know that that is something that is close to home, and that I wouldn't go so far as to say like I can't read it in books, but I like to know when I'm gonna be experiencing it, and I did not know that that's what I was in for. So it did take me aback. I did kind of have to like pause my audiobook, sit the book down for a moment and just breathe, take care of myself, all of that good stuff. Overall, I think I do like how it was handled. It wasn't done in any kind of gratuitous way, and even though it was kind of like revealed midway through the book, that felt organic to like our main character's experience of struggling to come to terms with it. Aside from that, I did just end up really kind of falling in love with the romance itself. It took me a little while, but once I was in, I was in. The speculative element of the apartment kind of being this time slip portal kind of place, where essentially our main character Clementine in present day is staying in this house at the same time that the hero is staying 7 years ago. But the apartment is kind of like overlapping those two times, and so that's the first time they meet. But they're in different timelines, so obviously that hugely complicates things. It's not science fiction or fantasy in the way that we're seeking to really understand the nitty-gritty of how and why this is happening. It just is, and it's kind of like a mechanism that adds a little bit of spice to an otherwise, you know, pretty simple contemporary romance. So although it did take a little while to build up for me, I think this is the most fun I've had so far in this video, which hopefully bodes well for our next book. Hopefully it means we're on an upwards trajectory, because you know that this is the book I have been looking most forward to. So I'm keeping all of my fingers and all of my toes crossed that this is going to be a big win. I'm honestly kind of nervous to finally be getting to it, but we've waited long enough. I'm gonna get to reading. So remember how I said I was gonna read all these books in 5 days? Well, everything was going on track for me to get the video out to you on the weekend. Clearly that didn't happen, and you might be able to hear why. I got sick. Not terribly sick, but sick enough that I wasn't really in the mood for reading, and definitely not for filming. But today is Valentine's Day. Today is the 14th of February, and I have finished this morning The Vampires of El Norte. So even though this did take me a few extra days than I'd intended, it's kind of perfect timing, right? Now, I know a couple of years ago everybody was really in love with The Hacienda by this author. I never got around to reading it, but I absolutely will now, because I loved this book. I absolutely loved it. So this is a bit of like a genre mashup kind of book. It's set in the 19th century in Mexico, and I would say at its core it's an historical romance with gothic speculative elements. I don't think it's incorrect to call this a horror book, because I mean, to me, like things that fall under that gothic kind of umbrella, especially when they include supernatural elements like vampires, I think they rightly belong in that category, even if they're not kind of like your stereotypical horror. Having said that, I wouldn't say that horror is like the primary genre. I think this is historical romance first and foremost. We're introduced to our two main characters when they're quite young, actually, when they're about 13. There's Nena, who is the eldest daughter of like a wealthy landowner, and then there's Nestor, who is not wealthy. His family do not own land. And we establish very early on in the book that these two kids have had
a very, very close, intimate kind of connection ever since they were young. But we've met them at the age 13 when Nana's family is starting to think of her more as a young woman rather than a child, and what that means for her future, especially when it comes to her marriage prospects. But despite that, these two kids do have really kind of grand romantic notions of a life together. That is until one evening when they're out together when they shouldn't be, and Nana gets attacked by this grotesque monster. Nestor believes that Nana's dead, and he is just so grief-stricken but also terrified of what her family will do to him, and also he places a lot of the blame on himself for not protecting her, and so all of these very complicated big feelings result in him running away. The story picks up again about 9 years later when Nestor is asked to return, and when he does so, he discovers that Nana is very much alive. Now at first I thought that she was going to be the vampire, and I was very excited about like that potential, but that's not where the book went. Instead, Nestor has been asked to return as a favor to Nana's family, basically, to help protect the area as the Anglos, the Yankees, come in and try to take over the land. For Nestor, he's just shocked that Nana's alive, and at first he's thrilled, but then obviously a whole bunch of different emotions about guilt and the fact that he left her, they come up too. For Nana though, from her perspective, Nestor just left. She didn't know why, she never heard from him, and so they're both dealing with this great, deep, aching grief, but from two very different perspectives, and I suppose two very different kinds of grief. And so this is far from an easy or romantic reunion. And obviously we have the threat of the Yankees, the Anglos, coming in and trying to take over the land, but in the background is the lingering and kind of increasing threat of these beasts that seem to be plaguing the night and hunting people down and, you know, sucking the life and the blood out of large animals. I thought the atmosphere in this was really well done. It felt eerie and kind of a bit creepy and insidious, but not outright like terrifying. And now I'm going to speak about very vague spoilers, as I often do, but if you don't want any spoilers, skip this part. Essentially, we discover that the vampires are kind of like a weapon of the Anglos. They're a weapon of American imperialism. Now, this book is obviously one that uses that metaphor and analogy in a very kind of like simple, straightforward kind of way. But what I really liked is that there were a few hints of further meaning and further layers that I think would be quite easy to miss if you were just paying attention to the romance. One of those is a genuine spoiler, but I want to talk about it because I found it really interesting, and I think it's the part of the book that made me realize I wasn't just having a good time with the romance, but I was really loving this book. There's one point when Nestor and Nana are kind of like hiding away together, and a Yankee kind of walks up to confront them. And before their very eyes, we essentially watch this Yankee like transform into or birth a vampire, one of these horrible bat-like creatures. And we don't learn much else about where these vampires come from or what they are. This is kind of the only information that we're given. And so to me, I very much took this to mean that like the violent act of imperialism and colonialism is dehumanizing in and of itself. Like obviously the violence that the Yankees are, you know, sowing upon the land of Mexico is horrific. But I think what this moment of transformation shows is that in order to dehumanize a people to such an extent that you're willing to, you know, wipe them off their land, you have to be completely disentangled from your own humanity as well. Imperialism requires a violence not only onto others, but also onto the self. So even though it is they who are perpetuating the very real active violence upon the people and upon the land, we see how they themselves are nothing more than beasts and cogs in a greater machine of imperialism, and how they cannot free themselves by participating in that violence. In fact, it is only by doing the opposite that they can ever be free. And I just thought that that was kind of really beautiful. It was horrific in a way, but it was also really beautiful. To me, I felt like this book was seeking to reclaim and re-story like creatures of horror, especially given that horror and so much of classic horror, not all of it, but a lot of it, is very rooted in colonialism. I think the other thing that it does very powerfully is position imperialism as a kind of apocalypse. One of my favorite things about this book was the writing. Some of the similes and metaphors just within the writing, especially when it came to the landscape or the romance, honestly just delectable. I can definitely see for some people this might be considered a bit too purple in the prose. I ate it up. I loved it. I am actually a little surprised I enjoyed the romance as much as I did. I loved Nestor and Nana. Oh my god, I loved them almost immediately. So much of the tension in this relationship though is centered around miscommunication, and that is often something that just shits me in romance. But I think in here, because there were so many external factors as to why the miscommunication was happening. Like, it wasn't just that one person was feeling one kind of way and they weren't being honest with those feelings. Instead, there were so many external expectations and restrictions on this romance that led to them kind of sometimes holding their cards close. Because while this book definitely, like, a big theme is imperialism, colonialism, I would say another one is definitely around class. It's not super, like, in depth, but the class dynamic, especially between Nana and her family and Nestor and their class positioning, and why he is not seen as a worthy suitor, like, at all. Why he is seen as so below Nana's family and her station. Now, one thing I do want to mention, and is definitely something that I was thinking about while reading, but is a massive gap in my own knowledge, and that is that although this book is about the invasion of the Yankees into Mexico, Nana's father is a landowner here, and we're told sometime earlier in the book that, like, he was given that land from the Spanish king or something. And so again, the specifics of how colonization unfolded in the Americas is not something I'm, like, super well versed on at all. But at least as far as I could gather from my understanding of this time and place, was that Nana's family were descendants themselves of colonizers. So while I absolutely loved this and I really enjoyed this as a book, as a story, as a romance, and like all the atmosphere around it and with the vampires, a little part of me was kind of wanting, I suppose, a little bit more nuance around the colonizer conversation. Like I said, I really liked the way that the vampires were used as a metaphor. I thought it was much more intricate than I think a lot of people are giving it credit for. But I suppose contrasted with Nana and her family, at least if I'm reading this correctly, please correct me if I'm wrong, that context or at least acknowledgement was something that I felt like was potentially lacking in here. So if you have any thoughts on that, I would love to hear them in the comments below. But I cannot tell you how much I loved the reading experience. I was so in the atmosphere and in this relationship. I was 100% invested. But with all that said, we have now finished our 5 books for this reading vlog. Obviously, Vampires of El Norte was my favorite book by far, but I have been kind of thinking more and more about the 7-Year Slip in the last 4 or 5 days. And I suppose one thing I wanted to add about this book was I think my favorite thing about it in retrospect, I think in the moment I was kind of caught up in the romance and also that suicide and grief conversation in particular. But after the fact, after having read this and just kind of like thinking about it from time to time, I think my favorite thing about it is the way that our 2 characters had to kind of come to terms with this 7-year slip itself. And I'm going to get a little bit spoilery again, but I suppose in order for them to have a relationship going forward, they just kind of have to accept who each other is at that moment and accept that we change. And if you truly love a person and want to be in a relationship with somebody long term, you can't just love one idea of that person or one facet of them or one part of them. You have to learn to love them in their entirety, in their complexity. And I think that's something that this book captured really, really beautifully, and it's kind of the thing that has stayed with me after reading it. Anyway, I just wanted to add that in. I've really been thinking about this book in the last few days, and yeah, it's grown a little in my estimation, I have to admit. But anyway, those are our 5 books that we read together in a little over 5 days. I hope you enjoyed hanging out with me and reading some romance and romance adjacent books. And I suppose while it was not my initial plan, it is kind of cute that I actually get to upload this on Valentine's Day. So sending lots of love to all of you. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. A big thank you as always goes to my lovely patrons over on Patreon, and especially big thank you goes to Olivia, Lynette Brown and Marie. And I will talk to you again soon, hopefully when I'm sounding a little less nasally. Until then, happy reading. Bye.